Welcome everybody, and thank you for taking your time out in the day to join us for a first in a sort of a series that we're starting to develop around sort of our webinar series here at 4R Systems. So without further ado, I'm going to talk about the impossible in terms of how we achieve the impossible in today's 2020 retail grocery environment, and how we sort of delivering the best in consumer experience when the rules keep changing. And appreciate the rules have always changed in retail significantly, but I think over the last 7-8 months, certainly since Q1 of this year, we've been experiencing significant changes pretty much on a daily basis. So without further ado, I want to just introduce myself. I'm the President and CEO of 4R Systems, and have the fortunate opportunity to lead the company in our sort of supply chain and merchandising solutions. And my contact information is there as a follow-up post this webinar. So what I'd like to do is really just take about 15-20 minutes of your valuable time and just talk to you a little bit more about the what we see as the sort of the supply chain challenges in grocery. I'm going to spend a little bit of time really on 4 key challenges. Understand obviously there's many challenges out there, but we've selected 4 of those that really fit within our sort of our core competency around inventory and how consumers are changing significantly, and how we can address those key challenges. And then also just conclude with a little bit of an update around some of the specific solutions and how we can address some of those key challenges within the grocery retail business. Grocery being one of those industry sectors that we're focusing our energy and our solutions and our development activities as well. So without going into the details at this point, from a housekeeping perspective, we're using Microsoft Teams at live event. It is a newer solution to us, so bear with us. Hopefully the technology will work through this 20-minute presentation. I believe everybody at this point is on mute. I'll obviously go through the main presentation, but what I will do at the end is pause for questions. Now I believe there is a slight there's an ability to ask a live audio question, but there's a Q&A chat section. So we've got some team members on the call here to help kind of facilitate that. So if there's any questions as we go, please put them in the Q&A chat. I believe it's up on the top right-hand corner of the Teams live event. So let's get to it. So the 2020, I'm sure a lot of us are probably ready for 2020 to be over. It's been certainly the last 10 months. It's been a roller coaster, but let's talk particularly into sort of the challenges in retail, in the grocery side specifically. So what we're seeing is sort of significant shift, and obviously I think this is very common, a significant shift over to the online purchasing. Certainly back in March, we saw a number of our clients that had a very strong e-commerce presence, even outside of grocery, that were able to move a significant amount of their overall demand over to their e-com channel. And obviously, particularly in grocery, we've seen the birth of a number of concepts around curbside pickup to the growth and significant growth around sort of the delivery, and Instacart being one of those. Then there's the second area of as consumers, we've significantly changed specifically how we buy. Again, it's moving from sort of the basic of bricks and mortar going into the store to ordering online, pick up in store, etc. And then also, how does that work from an inventory plan perspective? And how do you all these different nodes now in sort of fulfillment demand channels? How do you affect those within the within your inventory plan? And then just to quickly touch on a couple of those additional supply chain disruptors. So let me progress the slides here. So shifting to the online purchasing, as we've seen over the last, pretty much since Q2 of last year, really up until Q2 of this year, it's been a significant shift from from sort of bricks and mortar to a significant growth, in the overall e-com channel as demand has shifted now from physically being in the store to a significant growth as a result, primarily, obviously, as COVID, as we're all socially distancing and dealing with various different sort of types of lockdowns, etc., and restrictions and those types of things. So we've seen a significant shift, and what we've seen over we've had retailers that have had significant shift that have had to close all of their stores in essence because they weren't in essence critical retail, critical business, but they've been able to maintain a significant amount of their business as it's moved over to the e-com channel. But then we've had other retailers that have been able to I've seen double-digit growth, particularly in convenience and home improvement and grocery, where they've moved a significant amount of their demand as just double-digit growth, as well as a growth in their e-com channels as well. So this is consistent with the source here that based on the US Consensus Bureau, particularly in retail, and the shift from total overall sales to the percentage that's increased from an e-com perspective. So what we've seen here again is that we've seen 16% of sort of as a total percent of retailers has grown. Between just Q1 and Q2, there's been a 5 to 6% increase in overall total e-commerce movement as well. The trick is, though, how do you address those channels? All of a sudden, there's been this massive shift, different ways of fulfilling these types of different demands as we go through that change. And this is changing on a geographic basis. It's changing on a national basis as well. And so how do you deal with those, with some of those changes in demand that are happening pretty much on a daily, weekly basis? And then also we introduced the term here. Last year it was very much buy online, pick up in store. Now it's very much on buy online, pick up at the curb. And how do grocery retailers fulfill that, where you've seen a significant demand on various different products, etc., but also now a different fulfillment channel that you've now got to make sure that it's in the store once that order comes through, and have the ability to have that available at the the curbside, ready for when that consumer drives up to pick up their delivery. So we've seen 50% of consumers in essence moving over to the BOPAC. And so, what does that mean in terms of forecasting sort of in-store versus your online and separately? So you've got different demand channels that have grown, and again, where the online now is more significant in terms of a demand channel, and making sure that we're predicting those types of demand shifts and not overreacting as well. And I think that's part of, as we go through a bit more detail around the forecast and how to handle those different types of demand channels. But ultimately, at the end of the day, getting to a single forecast. How do you handle all of these different channels that are changing consistently, sort of significantly, but at the same time providing some stability, within the supply chain, all the way back through to the distribution center and ultimately back to vendors. Considering that vendors are also dealing with product shortages based on increased demand, or their ability to source product and source raw materials to support all of these different channels and changes. So just a quote here from Forbes. I think the predictions is that 59% of people are likely continue to leverage the curbside pickup post the pandemic. So we're seeing and expecting that BOPAC and potentially other types of initiatives are going to continue on as part of how consumers are interacting and buying and purchasing grocery supplies, etc. So if we just move over quickly, just a graphical view of that, I think some quotes that, based on sort of industry analysis, is that 31% say of consumers surveyed that home delivery is more expensive, they're not willing to pay for the service, whereas 17% would prefer to opt for the curbside. So I think it's a balance of sort of the different delivery channels, whether it be actual delivery, the Instacart approach per se, or also the curbside pickup, and also sort of the pickup in store as well. So if we progress then to, well, how do retailers, grocery retailers in particular, we've seen this birth of what we call dark stores, micro fulfillment centers, really, as to how do you position product closer to the consumer that you can actually react quick, much faster to these ever-changing demands, in the grocery space, and also supporting the the .com, the sort of e-com channels as well. And so this adds more complexity as you add in more distribution points in the network. That adds in additional risk as well. And so, but how do you account for those? What items should you be carrying in those fulfillment centers, as well as how much of those particular items, what's the prediction around demand that's going to occur, and sort of preempting that additional node in the network, or nodes in the network, now that you've now got to fulfill these micro fulfillment centers quickly, to be able to support the online demand that are coming through the various different channels, whether it be physically in store, or whether it be delivery, or whether it be BOPAC, or the buy online pickup in store channels as well. So it's, from a 4R perspective, it's very, very much getting down to what we call true demand, understanding how the interactions of these different channels play against each other, and making sure that you've got the right stock, at the right time, right down to the individual item at that individual stocking location, fulfillment location, but ultimately at that point when that demand occurs, that you have that series of products available to support the various different multiple channels, and it's accessible, and you've got the right levels of inventory, but not carrying too much inventory that you're now you're in an excess situation. And also looking at it from a sort of a product stratification perspective, that way back in the beginning, who would have expected that that toilet paper in essence was flying off the shelves, now, but now there's it's very much a focus on disinfectant products and cleaning products and hand sanitizers and all the other different and the basic principles as well, focus on certain other products that at the time, at the beginning of this year, were not necessarily sort of a prioritized from a high priority A perspective. They're more sort of BC products, but all of a sudden now you've got this massive shift to these very high priority products that has got supply issues. How do you allocate those across the different supply chain channels, and make sure that whatever supply you do have, you can actually effectively get it to the market in the right locations at the right time to support those different demand channels. So a lot of challenges there, particularly in that shift to online. This is just a bit of a representation here around the different channels. We talk about e-commerce, we talk about store locations, bricks and mortar, but also now adding in these micro fulfillment locations as well, that in essence could be a point where you are holding product for a short period of time to support the store locations, to support the e-com channels, but they're also where you could be servicing delivery providers as well out of these fulfillment locations. But ultimately, all that resides back to a distribution center, and the different varieties of that could also incorporate direct store delivery. So again, this is just a very simple representation of what has now become a very, very complex distribution network. And then also getting back to the vendors, where they've got their supply chains, and we've got vendors, product supply shortages, etc. So there's only so much of the particular product available, and how do you allocate it across the different nodes in the network to make sure that you're supplying to fulfilling the customer requirements, but also balancing, is that going to be a store location, is it going to be an e-com channel, is it going to be a fulfillment location? So balancing those inventory requirements and prioritizing the demand across those multiple channels. So as we've moved a significant amount of business and sort of over to the e-commerce channel, and we've now completely added a lot of complexity to the distribution network, how we fulfill locations, etc. We've now got consumers who are changing their behavior. So just some of the overall key changes here. Patterns in shopping hours. Way back in the beginning, we were seeing peak shopping hours were changing, actual reduction in overall shopping hours. So you got a smaller percentage of available time to adjust. Also, you got a different client, a different consumer going in, particularly in the very beginning when there was introduction of senior hours in essence. And how do you accommodate that? Because it's a different buying pattern if you're versus the regular consumer that was going in. Changes, overall changes in the purchasing behavior. I talked a little bit about sort of those high demand items prior to sort of March of this year. These were probably just regular items that in continuous replenishment, always there on the shelf, to all of a sudden now these are like high top priority items that you just continuous staples that you don't want to be out of stock on. And how do you, but you've only got a certain amount of inventory available, how do you allocate those across the different channels within the network? And then finally is the larger basket. I certainly know from our family perspective, we probably go to the grocery store 2 or 3, 4 times a week maybe, but very much now it's one time a week. You want to minimize your exposure to being in those types of environments. So therefore it's a lot more of it's moving to one time or twice a week. And how has that changed from an overall buying perspective, and how do we forecast that? How do you make sure that you're supplying, you've got those products available in the mornings versus certain other products that need to have later on throughout the course of the day? So it's those significant changes in overall consumer demand. And and so this is really where 4R comes in. Part of our forecasting engine is very much predicting right down at the individual product level, right down at the individual fulfillment location, whether that be e-com, whether that be a fulfillment center, whether that be a store, incorporating all of those different disruptions, seasonality. Is it on promotion? Is it not on promotion? Is it a different demand profile as we go throughout the course of the day, making sure that we're accommodating all of those differing shifts in buying, and also in terms of the different channels as well. So very much utilizing the core of our machine learning and AI algorithms and applying a lot of science to understanding those different patterns and making sure we're accommodating those as we go into the producing that future forecast, predicting demand going forward. We talked a bit about promotions. This is an interesting way to what I call demand shaping, demand massaging the overall demand, in terms of, we do know there's a shortage of certain products. There's a global supply shortage. You might not necessarily have a certain size, but you have let's say there's a 500 ml, you have a 750 ml available. How does that demand transfer? And an ability to actually apply promotions where you can actually shift demand and bring customers into the store potentially more often, but also shift demand that you can move promotional goals and allow for a movement of demand if there's a shortage or there's an out of stock situation. These are very useful ways to what we call demand shape and incorporate that into the demand forecasting as you go forward. Not to get into the nitty-gritty details, but again, we use a lot of machine learning capability to apply promotional lifts whether that be promotional lists that we generate or our clients generate. But ultimately, they're demand modifiers. They change demand, whether it be a price, whether it be promo type, whether it be buy one, get one free, etc., different circulars. All are different, what we call temporary price reductions, and also non-temporary price reductions as well. So these are all components that add a lot more complexity to supply chain, the demand profiles as well. So how do you now pivot? These are all sort of massive changes in sort of how consumers are buying, how your supply chain's got much more complex. But now, how does it come down to sort of pivoting that inventory plan? And that's really where we get into the world of replenishment. So, for instance, demand substitutability. We talk a lot about, and I've talked a little bit about supply chain, product availability, etc. There are out of stocks, and how do you accommodate those out of stocks? And our replenishment and solution focuses on making sure we've got those right items, those high priority items that have got availability, and how do you make sure you're reducing those out of stocks based on what you have available? But at the end of the day, you've only got so much available. So how do you allocate it if you're in a constrained environment? And understanding that substitutability, how does demand transfer from one particular item over to another item if you, for instance, out of stock, and how do you do that online and as well, and understanding those different characteristics between the relationships of various different products. So and it's part of making sure that we've got all of that in terms of the overall approach as well. And then finally, I think, as we talk a little bit more about some of the supply chain disruptions, staying in stock, there we've also got to consider shelf life, date coded products, etc. That again is part of our replenishment approach in terms of how we handle shelf life, date coded products. Certain SKUs, certainly have kind of obviously, particularly if you're in produce and certain other categories have lower shelf lives, etc. And so how do you account for those? And that's again where our replenishment approach comes into play, specifically around date coding and shelf life, and balancing that out with predicting the overall demand, and when will I need to be making sure that I'm not actually adding more into the supply chain, and I'm going to end up with in essence out of date products. And so again, balancing all of those different sort of pressures on sort of the supply chain, and making sure that those types of things are accounted for. But also talking a lot about allocating different inventory levels to different stores. Profiling the stores. Are they in certain locations? Are there certain higher demand stores in terms of certain categories in one store versus another store that is down the street? And so how do you allocate across the different store types and the different product graph categories, etc. So I think we talk a little bit more about stranded inventory. The key thing here is that once it's out into the store location or it's in a distribution center, you want to make sure you've got just the right amount of inventory, that you're not in essence going into an excess situation where you've what we call stranded inventory. It's costly to pull it back if it doesn't sell or it becomes perishable, etc. So it's a balancing, a fine tuning of all the different components, whether it be across the supply chain perspective, all the different fulfillment nodes in the location, the different channels, and balancing that across to make sure that when we're not in an excess situation, that we have to write inventory off, or we've got what we call stranded inventory within the DC, or ultimately in the fulfillment or in a store location. So one of the other key areas, as I say, we've seen a number of our retail clients, particularly in grocery, that have seen double-digit growth. But how long is that growth going to continue? Is there some point that this is going to level out? And so how do we handle those long-range forecasts, and sort of how do we understand the changing lead times? There's going to be at some point a new normal, in terms of all of the different channels and the BOPAC and the buy online, pick up in store, etc. And so how what's that going to do to the overall long range forecast? And so again, it's massaging those longer term range forecasts to predict, in essence, where consumer demand's hopefully going to go, but also giving some stability all the way back to the vendor side, that they've got some longer term visibility as to potential shifts in products, and making sure that they've got a stability from what orders are you going to be placing back up through the supply chain as well. So again, long range forecast is certainly critical, and that's something again within our demand planning solution that handles those long range forecasts and predictability, and there's some fine tuning and massaging of those as you move forward into the future. So on the last quick approach is sort of 4R is we're a cloud-based predictive analytics. I've talked a number of different solutions here around predicting from a forecast demand planning perspective to replenishment, etc. But what we are a company that focus on sort of data mining in sort of key areas. Number one is in supply chain. So we talk a lot about replenishment, forecasting, but also in the merchandising space as well. When we talk about things like assortment optimization, what items should you carry? Should you stock this in this location versus stock it in that location? So these are all different solutions that we can apply to what is becoming an increasingly challenging and significantly more complex sort of environment, particularly in grocery retail. So to that point, we actually have a grocery solution suite in the three core areas: demand planning, where we talk about forecasting product life cycle, as I talked about, some date-coded shelf life, very sophisticated solutions features within promotions, seasonality, your price elasticity, and the other area for us is where it's a single unified forecast. So depending on, irrespective of what solution we're focusing on here, whether it be replenishment, assortment, or even the world of allocation, it's the same demand planning approach. It's the same demand planning solution. So it's a single unified forecast across all of those different components within supply chain and merchandising. And then also we work through that moves over into the omnichannel replenishment. Again, taking that forecast and supporting with automated replenishment, whether it's centralized planning, looking at delivery schedules, incorporating lead times, incorporating the daily stock out status, support for DSD, which is again another area that we're seeing a significant amount of growth in terms of DSD vendors supplying directly to the stores or the fulfillment locations versus it going through a proprietary distribution center. And then more focus really on sort of the assortment. What items should be in the assortment? Should I carry this item in this fulfillment location? Is it productive? Is it going to generate? Is the demand for that item particularly in that particular location? And so assortment optimization is looking at those types of decisions and analyzing those types of problems, but ultimately getting down to what we call the product attribute, understanding these different items have a certain size, for instance, is an attribute, and that drives a certain amount of demand, and understanding how that demand drives the assortment plan, which ultimately drives the demand plan and obviously the replenishment plans going forward. And then another area, what we call SKU rationalization as well, really focusing on, are these items, in this particular location, is it netting a return specific to its profile, and looking at it from a financial perspective, which ultimately drives in stocks as well. But it's what we call a very laser focused sort of lens that we look at that from an item location, whether it be a physical or virtual location perspective. But all of that is accessed through our web portal, and we have an ability where we actually run this sort of these solutions as well as clients and customers, and actually interact directly through a web portal and have access to all of these capabilities, whether we're looking at demand planning, combination of replenishment, or looking at a complete end-to-end grocery solution going forward. So I think one last piece, talked a lot about solutions, but also we offer a number of analytics services. We've got more coming online. We just issued a press release recently. But these are 4 core sort of key analytics services where these are very, there's a very well-defined scope, and it can be very laser focused on a particular business issue. SKU rationalization, is a service that we've brought to market specifically around looking at these items in these locations. Should we potentially, are they productive products? Are they productive in that location? Should they be potentially stocked in a different location? Should they, when it comes to what items should I put into that, maybe that micro fulfillment center, that dark store? SKU rationalization is a service that we offer that can help drive those business decisions. Clustering analysis, again, really getting down to how localized do I need to be to service my consumers based on consumer demand. So optimizing the different offerings of products across the different locations and sort of grouping those in not necessarily, typically they're in it from a geographic perspective, but really focusing on what are the drivers here as to my different store groups across different categories, and how do I apply those in a localized environment. And clustering analysis is in essence one of those service offerings. Promotion effectiveness, was that promotion effective? Should I be carrying a different promotion? Let's talk about demand shaping, and sort of giving you the insights as to what potentially promotions you should be planning in the future, what categories, what set of SKUs, where should you be planning those promotions. Again, is another service that we have as a service offering. And then finally is more recently is looking at sort of a supplier health check. One of the things that we've got a lot of, obviously a lot of supply chain data, particularly in sort of historical data, and we're getting those very, very frequent updates. So it gives us the ability to provide what we call a supplier health check, looking at and converting those potential short shipments or product unavailability, and what does that ultimately do to my lost sales? Am I losing sales? By how much? And so that's one of those key areas that we provide outputs in sort of that supplier health check area as well. So I think in summary, it's been a hell of a 2020. I think number one is we've seen, I know you as retailers are seeing significant changes from consumer buying behavior, from all the new sort of buy online, pick up at curbside, etc. How consumers are buying, etc. But really, a lot of that data, a lot of that information is actually is within the data that we, as part of a exchange of data, that we have the tools and the analytics and the capabilities to mine that information and provide tangible business benefits, whether it be in forecasting, demand planning, replenishment, assortment from a solutions, but also initial services as well, that are very very predictable, provide very tangible business benefits. So gone over time slightly here, but I want to just give everybody how 4R can address some of these challenges in the grocery space. We do focus on other retail verticals as well, but primarily want to just spend a little bit of time with everybody just to provide a little bit more insight into how 4R can support grocery and convenience as well, because there's a lot of similarities in sort of the convenience retail space as well. So I'm going to pause at this point, and I'm going to ask Jess, who's on the line, hopefully, if we've got any questions. Just a reminder, we can't turn the audio on for attendees, but if you do have questions in the Q&A session, there is a window, I believe, at the top right-hand corner. If you don't, that's okay. We can certainly follow up. My email is here on the screen, and this is being recorded and will also be available via a link that we'll be sending out on the website post this webinar. So, Jess, I'm going to hand over to you to see if there's any questions.
Thanks, Mark. We do have a question. It says, can 4R use our data to guide us in knowing if we should create dark stores in our chain?
Yes and no. I think yes, certainly from analyzing the data and in terms of sort of where its potential to create, you know, a fulfillment. Well, not necessarily physically where to create it, but should you have a different node in the network and sort of creating the simulations. Well, if I was to add this fulfillment center or this dark store to my network, what would that do to my supply chain flow? And so, yes, in essence, partially to understand, you know, if I put that location, what does that do to my network and ultimately to my how I fulfill and forecast demands and etc. and lead times. So all of that from a simulation perspective. What it's not going to tell you, or what we don't have the ability, is where exactly you should put that fulfillment location. But certainly, should you need a fulfillment location, yes, and we would do that through what we call a simulation approach, based on sort of the data and the analytics that we would apply. Okay. Anything else?
We have one more.
Okay.
How should retailers handle data from 2020 in the future when it has been such an anomaly of a year?
The one word comes to mind: carefully. We've had you know, we've had retail clients that have seen double-digit growth. We've had retail clients that have had all of their stores closed, and you know, percentages of that demand's moved over to e-commerce. So with regards to using 2020 historical data to drive future demand, I think the word is depends, and I say depends carefully in that how much of that is really truly reflective. And I think it depends on, you know, what situation you're in. If it's in double-digit growth, particularly in grocery, then yeah, there's going to be a flattening out of that curve at some point. So it's really more on the long range forecast, because obviously I don't predict that we're going to continuously see double-digit growth. You know, for the foreseeable future. So we've got some various tools and mechanisms